Okay, so our moderators today are going to be myself and my friend Christopher Bedford here. So Chris is currently an associate editor at the Daily Caller, dailycaller.com. It's a great news organization. He's also the vice chairman of Young Americans for Freedom and executive editor of their magazine, The New Guard. And that's where I met Chris, was through YAF and working on the magazine together. And right now, I'm going to ask him to give his opening statement.
Hi, thanks for having me, Adam. Thanks for coming out on this beautiful Saturday. We're here to talk today about the conservatives and the GOP. And I think that one thing that's important to keep in mind is a little bit of the history of the conservatives and the GOP. A lot of people talk about how the Republicans have abandoned conservative principles and they've betrayed conservatives and left them out. And I think it's important to keep in mind that Republicans aren't inherently conservative. It's not a conservative party. They're interested mainly in power, and conservatives have managed to hijack them a few times, and that's for the better. First time in 1964 when we got Barry Goldwater on the ticket and led the Republicans to a massive electoral defeat. So they were probably a little sour on us after that. Then when we primaried Gerald Ford, because he wasn't conservative, and led them to another electoral defeat. And then finally we won with Ronald Reagan, who changed America and changed the GOP. And right now we've kind of been running on his fumes for a couple decades, and people think, the conservatives thought, well, if we can sit back now, Reagan's won, the GOP is conservative. But it's not. They put forward after that Bob Dole, H.W. Bush, John McCain, Mitt Romney, who is maybe even the best of all of them. And today we're here to talk about what we can do to hijack them and make it so they get Stockholm Syndrome and they don't want to run out the window as soon as we take the gun away from their head, and actually make it a conservative party, because we certainly don't have the Democrats to go to today.
All right, thanks, Chris. And the way this is going to work is Chris and I are going to be asking some questions to our esteemed panel here, and we're going to ask that they try to keep their answers brief so we can get through as much as possible. So first, let me introduce Richard Viguerie, who is the chairman of conservativehq.com, an organization that, or it's a website that deals with Tea Party and conservative movement news. Chris and I both used to work there. And Mr. Viguerie is known as the funding father of the conservative movement. Was very influential in starting conservative direct mail. He still has a mailing company, American Target Advertising, in Manassas. Was one of the prominent figures in getting funds raised for the Reagan administration, for various conservative political figures and causes, and has written numerous books about kind of the topic that we have today about the issues between the conservative movement and the Republican Party. A number of articles, still writes today on Conservative HQ, so check that out. And we're happy to have him here today. In the middle, we have the lovely Kate Edwards, who is the program officer for chapter services at Young Americans for Freedom, and yesterday just got engaged, so congratulations.
Thank you.
So since Young Americans for Freedom and Young Americans Foundation merged, Kate now oversees the chapter building of YAF chapters across the country and college campuses, and is a very good young conservative activist originally born in England, right, and lived in Wisconsin, now with YAF here for about a year now. Mm-hmm. So glad to have Kate with us today. And finally, Chris Malagisi, who's president of the Young Conservatives Coalition, which is a DC-based professional organization for conservative activists and young professionals. YCC does a number of things around DC, gives out the William F. Buckley Award, They just started a new fellowship program, which Mr. Bedford's a fellow at, and they produce the Reagan-Palooza event that happens before CPAC, or during CPAC every year. And Mr. Malagisi is also a adjunct professor at American University, teaches about the conservative movement, teach a number of classes at Leadership Institute, which is probably where I first met him. So very knowledgeable about the history of the conservative movement and conservative principles. So thanks for being here, Chris. Oh, and I also, before we get to the questions, I want to thank our co-sponsors today, which were Fauquier County Republican Committee, which I'm a member of, and you can check them out at fauquiergop.com, and Piedmont Republican Women's Club, which we have a couple members here today, including their president, sitting over there, and FauquierFreeCitizen.com, which is a new news site that only deals with issues of Fauquier County, and you can check them out. So we're gonna start with Mr. Viguerie and dive into the questions here. And every person on the panel will get a chance to answer. Just keep in mind, try to keep your answers brief. So, Mr. Viguerie, if you could explain in what ways the conflict and the alliance between the Republican Party and the conservative movement that came out of the 1950s and the early 1960s is different from the political situation in which we find ourselves today.
Thank you, Adam. Father, I would add to what you said. I'm jealous. I've never had the pleasure of meeting Margaret Thatcher, but the big four, I've traditionally always said it was not Gorbachev, but an unemployed electrician, Lech Walesa, who jumped over a fence in 1981 and led a revolution in Poland. And because we had a Polish Pope and Lech Walesa there, and I like to use that example. And one of the things that I talk about, maybe we'll talk about a little later today, is the number one need that we have for our cause is leadership. And whatever leadership activities I've been able to be involved in and provide for the movement wasn't because somebody came knocking on my door and said, hey, Richard, would you do this or that? You know, you have to volunteer, step out front, and Lech Walesa did that. No one asked him to lead this revolution that changed the world, but he did. Now, Adam, in terms of, when I just a quick background, 1961, I went to New York to become executive secretary of Young Americans for Freedom. This organization, conservative youth organization, had been founded the year before on Bill Buckley's family estate in Sharon, Connecticut. And there was hardly anything you could call a conservative movement in those days. And, most Republicans referred to themselves as conservative, but they weren't ideological conservatives. I was one of the first of what I call second-generation conservatives. Bill Buckley, Russell Kirk, Frank Meyer, Barry Goldwater, they were first-generation conservatives. And second generation now, everybody on this stage but me is fourth-generation conservative. We've gone through third generation. We're in our fourth generation now. It's been a long evolutionary process, Adam, to get to where we are now. But the Republican politicians in those days, in the 60s, in the 70s, and to a large extent in the 80s, looked upon the conservatives as an appendage of the Republican Party. They certainly didn't think of us as peers. They thought of us as, kind of shock troops. We're the infantry. Whenever we need help here or there, we send them out on the front lines. And the idea that we would disagree with them, we have our own ideas. it's still a difficult thing for Republican leaders. You see it at the national level. You see it here in Virginia. They don't like the idea of people who are not elected officials influencing the Republican Party, and the Tea Party is a good example. They're very uncomfortable with that idea. But as uncomfortable as they are now, they were radically uncomfortable with it back in those days. It was just unheard of. You man your manners, you stood in the back of the room, you didn't say anything. And we've come a long ways. We've got a long ways to go yet, but we've come a long ways since then.
Okay. Well, first I just wanted to thank the Fauquier County Republicans for inviting me on this panel, specifically Adam and Chris Bedford for moderating. So I can't speak as eloquently on the difference between conservative movement and Republican Party in the 50s and 60s today as Mr. Viguerie can. But one thought that I had that I wanted to add was that, you know, back in the 60s, there certainly wasn't as much competition. There was Young Americans for Freedom, which was huge, and we're slowly building it back up today since the merge. But it's nowhere near the size that it used to be. And the reason for that is there's so much more competition by now all these conservative nonprofit groups, which in one way could be a bad thing, but I think it's also a good thing in that it allows for more, you know, conservative groups to target on specific issues that can hold the Republican Party accountable. So that's, when I looked at this question, the biggest difference that I see from then to today.
And I thank everybody, too, for being here, everybody for coming, everybody for on a beautiful, beautiful Saturday day. Chris and I were walking in, we're like, maybe we should do this outside. And Professor Cassandra, can we go outside for the? You know, just to, you know, to add on what Mr. Viguerie and Kate had said is, I think to answer the question, from the 1950s, the 1960s, at least when I teach in my class at American University, I teach a history of the conservative movement. The Republican Party today is a lot more accepting of conservatives than it was back at the appendage times, as Mr. Viguerie had said. And that was, you know, it was purposeful. There was a point in time where conservatives like Bill Buckley and others decided that the exact quote is that conservatism should be a movement of ideas in action with political consequences. You know, before the early 1960s, conservatism had been more of a philosophical, intellectual pursuit as opposed to a political pursuit. And you can see, come 1960s, 1970s, transition from a philosophical to more to a political movement. To today, it's with Ronald Reagan to now, it's more of a governing movement. And you can see the progress while people might be a little upset that Republicans are not as conservative as they should be right now compared to the 1950s and 1960s. Very different. But a good example, one example of the progress, look at the last two presidential cycles that we've had. Isn't it interesting how each candidate tried to out-conservatize the other on it there? Even Mitt Romney and John McCain, they both tried in their individual respects to out-conservatize the other. I'm making up a verb here. So, I mean, it is a sign of progress from the 1950s and 1960s, but hasn't always been that way.
This question, I think, is also best targeted, if you could start it off, Richard. There used to be a lot of Reagan Democrats, and conservatives weren't only in the GOP. But since the success of the conservatives in the Republican Party, a lot of those Reagan Democrats left the party and joined the Republicans. Do you think that flight from the Democrats and making the Democrats more left has worked for conservatives or against them by giving them less places to go?
Excuse me. Yeah. I was making a note of something I wanted to say, but you're asking about, say it, that last part is.
So has the liberalization of the Democratic Party and the conservatization of the Republican Party made it so that conservatives have left choices or more powerful?
You know, I would say it's been a good thing. There's no question, you know, that the Democrats were going to become ideological liberal. They were moving, have been moving in that direction for well over 100 years, and now we've seen it come to full fruition in our lifetime in the last couple of decades. So that was going to happen. When I was in New York in the 60s, we had a lot of Democrats on our advisory board, Young Americans for Freedom. It'd be unthinkable now to think of one Democrat that would be on your advisory board, much less dozens of them. So, and there have been pluses and minuses, but on balance, it's definitely a plus, I think. I'm writing a book now to come out this summer called Takeover, and it deals with what I think is the most important political battle in America, and it is not between Republicans and Democrats, it's not between the left and the right, it's inside the Republican Party, which the battle has been going on literally for 101 years. 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, the progressive, leads the Republican Party, starts the Bull Moose Party, leads directly to the election of Woodrow Wilson, America's first true progressive. It's a battle we've been going on for all this time, 100 years plus, and until until conservatives take over the Republican Party, it's going to be a problem. We're not going to be effective politically. The Democrats control the Democratic Party. Conservatives do not own and control the Republican Party. We operate in the Republican Party, but we don't own the party, and we're going to be frustrated until that happens.
Yeah, I agree with what Mr. Viguerie said, and I also think that not having Reagan Democrats in, nowadays, or having very few, certainly makes things more difficult. Having Reagan Democrats gives the GOP obviously more ability to reach across the aisle, get more done legislatively. It also gives credibility and good faith to the bargaining process, because we all know partisan gridlock isn't good for anybody. Not even Democrats either. And so it's definitely a bad thing that you're seeing more and more extremely liberal Democrats today who are unwilling to compromise. But I think it's also important that, you know, the Republican Party doesn't compromise on principles. And I think one of the main reasons we see Democrats being able to be extremely liberal is because of the media, which is probably something you all know, but I was really thinking this question through last night, and that, you know, you do have some conservative outlets, like you have the Daily Caller, you've got Breitbart and the Drudge Report, but in large... And conservativehq.com. But a lot of what the average American who isn't like us, who doesn't watch Fox News and CNN for fun, a lot of what they're seeing through the media is that it's so normal, or most Americans believe that being extremely liberal is totally normal, and that's fine. Even if they don't actually agree with the concepts and values, I think that it's portrayed as such a normal thing to be extremely left, that they're fine with it, and especially people my age. But then when you've got extreme conservatives, they're like crazy, insane people who should crawl back into their holes. And so that it's an uphill battle, and really that's what we're working against, especially conservative women who just get railed on in the media. I mean, it's awful. Like, good thing we've got, you know, warriors like Michelle Malkin, for example, who can really stick to their guns and not let the media kill them, so to speak. But I think that's one of the reasons that it's okay for liberals to have become progressively more liberal, and it does make things more difficult.
We call those holes bunkers.
I think a lot has been said on this. The only thing that I would add here is just part of the time in history, and I know we're going to get into this probably a little bit, but the conservative movement traditionally has been made up of three groups, the libertarians, traditionalists, and the anti-communists. I know we're going to get into that into a little bit, but I think there's been a natural diffusion of conservatives in the Democrat Party, just basic because of the times. Post-Cold War, I mean, we're not necessarily fighting that war anymore. So a lot of those Democrats like Scoop Jackson and some of the others who had been big Cold Warriors at the time, we don't have that bringing members from the Republican and the Democrat Party together as we used to. Even actually defense issues, I mean, even Republicans have a split between more the hawks and the doves these days. But there are some different aspects too. When you look at some of the social conservative issues, more people are coming more the traditionalist route on abortion, and you see that in statistics. On marriage, though, it's kind of going the other way, at least the trending of it at the time. So it's interesting. I think it's also part of the times that things are evolving a little bit, and it just and that might be adding to this diffusion.
All right, Chris. So Mr. Bedford here mentioned earlier about people tend to think of the conservative movement and the Republican Party as one. And Mr. Viguerie mentioned that, you know, in order for conservatives to really have power, we have to take over the Republican Party. Now, but do you think in the public's mind, when they see the GOP and the conservative movement as kind of the same thing, and you have Republican politicians making big gaffes, you know, voting for taxes, for regulation, does it hurt the conservative movement to be so closely connected to the Republican Party, and does it prevent the GOP from winning elections, that the conservatives kind of keep them from appealing too much to the middle of the aisle, I guess, because the conservatives are more about principles, and a lot of Republicans are more about, you know, compromise?
No, it's a great question, and in particular, the conservative movement, and I'm sure Mr. Viguerie can extrapolate on this a little better than me, but, you know, had been kind of the outside movement within the Republican Party. When I teach in my class, I have to remind my students there is the Republican Party, and then there is the conservative movement. The conservative movement is a set of principles and ideas that took over the Republican Party to be the vehicle in which to enact what they want. Remember, I said before, William F. Buckley's quote was, the conservative movement was to be a movement of ideas in action with political consequences. Has the party and the movement, have they cozied up too much together? I would think so. I think, again, in the post-Reagan, post-W. Bush era, the Republican Party and the conservative movement, I think, got a little too cozy together, especially in the mid-2000s. And you saw a lot of the conservative movement and Republican Party. It was hard to tell the difference between it. In 2010, the year of the Tea Party was kind of the personified or visceral wake-up, saying, reminding them, hey, you know, now it's not just about the establishment. There is the grassroots conservatives here that are still here. And we saw, I think that one of the messages of 2010 was not just a group of people who were upset about the way that the government was going. It was also a clarion call reminder that if you're not going to support small government, limited taxation, less regulation type of those issues, then yeah, we're going to have a 2010 type of an election. So, but I think, you know, since 2010, there's definitely been a lot of discussion, a lot of these type of panels and forums that have talked about the need to make sure that there's a differentiation between the conservative movement and the Republican Party. I don't think it's a bad thing that the conservatives find their home traditionally with the Republicans, as they tend to agree more on the same issues than Democrats, but it is an important distinction that we need to remind people about.
Do you want me next?
If you have anything to add, sure.
I'll just say quickly, I think the conservative movement and the Republican Party almost have to be closely intertwined. I think conservative groups, like the one I work for, Young Americans for Freedom, have to play a balancing game. They have to stand apart from the Republicans, especially legally if you're a 501c3, but while not alienating potential areas of support. And one of the organizations I thought of when I read this question was Susan B. Anthony List, because I think they do a really good job of being a principled conservative organization. They're a pro-life organization that doesn't compromise on their principle, which I don't think conservatives should do, but then they work with the Republican Party and candidates on getting effective legislation out there, and I think that's, you know, just one example of the two working together really well. That's really all I have to add.
Good, Kate. What I do is marketing. I have a company called American Target Advertising, and so it's advertising and marketing is what I do. And I can tell you the Republican brand is in serious trouble. Democrats have a brand. You ask people what the Democrat Party stands for, they can tell you. You know, I don't know what the Republican Party stands for these days, and I think in America's mind it's very muddled. And quite frankly, the opposite is true. I think that it is the moderate wing of the Republican Party that is preventing them from winning elections. In 2006, 2008, the voters threw the Republicans out of control of Congress and the White House, in my opinion, having nothing to do, literally nothing to do with Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, Barack Obama. Had everything to do with the Republican leaders. In my opinion, they're corrupt, and that's you know, the President of the United States, George Bush, Karl Rove, Denny Hastert, Bill Frist, John Boehner, Mitch McConnell. People don't like them. In 2012, they're back as the face of the opposition to the Democrats. People don't like the establishment Republicans. Look at the big victories the Republicans have had. 1980, 1984, even 1988, when George H.W. Bush is running for the third term of Ronald Reagan. 1994, 2010, the face of the opposition to the Democrats, you know, are people that they like. They like that message out there. And so if we want to continue to nominate establishment country club type Republicans, we're going to get the same results. People don't like them. The opposition to the Democrats in 2010 was the Tea Party, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, Marco Rubio, Rush Limbaugh, Hannity, Levin. That was the opposition. Boehner, Mitch McConnell, et cetera, Karl Rove were nowhere to be seen or heard from. People like that. And so I think going forward, salvation of the Republican Party lies with the conservatives. And I think that that's why it's so important for, if you like the Republican philosophy of government, you have to promote the conservative cause. Otherwise, we're not going to win many elections going forward.
This is a question I think best answered by Kate, although with a few generations of young conservative leaders up here, we can all talk to it. Young conservatives once formed the shock troops of the movement. They formed helped get Barry Goldwater elected, and helped get him nominated in 1964. They ran hard for Ronald Reagan, and it used to just be young Republicans, college Republicans, and Young Americans for Freedom. Today, and you've touched on this, there's a huge amount of conservative groups. And there's also much more restrictive IRS tax codes, which you've also talked on. So what role can the youth play in the future primary and general elections? And will we ever have the same kind of impact that we once did on the GOP and conservative politics?
Okay. Well, firstly, the IRS tax codes are extremely restrictive. Anyone who's worked for a 501c3 knows this. And they do hamper in large part the political activities of organizations like Young Americans for Freedom and what you can do. But I don't always see this as a bad thing, especially when I'm talking to the students in Young Americans for Freedom. Our goal is, instead of focusing on the next election, which is important, but short-term election, is focusing on winning over the next generation. And with the values that we hold so deeply as conservatives, you know, like a strong national defense, traditional values, and fiscal responsibility, free enterprise, these values, and just talking to their peers about it. They've got huge social capital with the other people who attend their colleges and high schools, and that they can speak with them about these issues is so important. And but then, of course, we know that the youth love being involved in political activities. I always was, and it is really important in elections. In just this past election, presidential election, voters aged 18 to 29 made up 19% of the electorate, which was bigger than in 2008. And as we know, they went for Obama by 60% to 36% for Romney. But there are a couple of things to acknowledge with this. Firstly, that we don't necessarily have a youth problem, but we have we do have a youth problem, but we don't have singularly a youth problem. The way we could focus in on it is we have a minority youth problem. Romney actually won the white youth vote, ages 18 to 29 in the past election, by 7 points, which isn't as significant as it should have been, but it's still significant. Obama did not win every demographic of the youth vote. However, he won the Hispanic youth vote by 51 points and then won the black youth vote by 83 points. So I think we need candidates that message better to minority youth, and we will see a rise again in youth wanting to be involved in the GOP, but I think it should be hugely focused on the candidates we pick. People like Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, Scott Walker from my home state of Wisconsin, really, they win the youth vote because they relate to the youth. and people believe that they care, and youth aren't going to vote for people who they think don't care about them and their needs. And for whatever reason, even though we know Mitt Romney is a very caring individual with his charitable donations and his life story, he did not come across as a caring person, which was so unfortunate and one of the major reasons he lost. So I think that's our biggest battle in winning over the youth. But no.
That was very interesting, Kate. I've never heard that before, that we don't have a white youth problem, it's a minority youth problem. That's fascinating. It's similar to we don't have a problem with women voters. We've got a problem with single women voters. We win married women, but it's single women. So when you break it apart and look at it like that, it makes it much easier to digest. In terms of fusionism, when I was in New York in the early 60s, that was a subject that was often talked about, and the kind of inventor, if you would, of fusionism was a fellow named Frank Meyer, who was a senior editor of National Review, and his son, Gene Meyer, runs the Federalist Society today. So that in those days, we really had a two-legged stool, and a two-legged stool is not very sturdy. And we was economic conservatives and foreign policy conservatives, and foreign policy really meant anti-communism. Every conservative that I know of the first and second generation, probably no exceptions, became conservatives because they were first anti-communist. Before you were a conservative, you were an anti-communist. So, and then in the late 30s with my friend who just passed away this past week, Howard Phillips, that Adam referred to, along with Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell, who founded the Moral Majority and brought the social conservatives into the conservative movement. That was the third leg of the stool. And three-legged stool is very sturdy, and we began to win elections, 51, 52%, not governing America yet. And now, in my opinion, in recent years, since 2009, we've added a fourth leg to that stool, and it's huge. And that fourth leg is the Tea Party. And I think it very different than the other three legs of the movement. People think, well, economic conservatives like Tea Party people want a balanced budget, less spending, less government regulation, et cetera. Yes, that's all true. But as we've referred here a number of times, that the conservatives have become an appendage, an arm of the Republican Party. They're not independent. The Tea Party is independent. Reagan running for president in 1976, running against the Republican establishment, the Nixon wing of the party, the Rockefeller wing of the party, the Ford. He was running against all of the establishment figures of the Republican Party. And so he's talked about we need new leadership, and I love his phrase, we need new leadership unfettered by old ties and old relationships. The Tea Party is unfettered. They're not tied to the Republican Party like most of my conservative friends at the national level are. I was the keynote speaker one weekend in Dallas in 2010. Tea Party leaders met with a dozen or so in my hotel room before the speech, more afterwards. I remember talking to a lady from Corpus Christi, Tea Party leader, had 2,000 or 3,000 members of her Tea Party there. And she said regularly when we have a meeting, politicians will call and want to come and speak to us. And I said, great, you come to the meeting. We'd love to have you there. And I tell you what, we'll introduce you. But you don't speak, you listen to us. I can't imagine, I don't have a conservative friend in this country that would talk to a Republican politician like that. The Tea Party is such a breath of fresh air.
I think Kate Ance and Richard were both very good. The only thing I would add here, not necessarily. It's interesting post-Reagan how democratized the conservative movement has become. And instead of 3 groups, we now have 50 groups of different youth groups that are out there. And it's interesting. We still keep losing the youth vote. We haven't won it since 1988, I believe, was the last time that the Republicans have won. I think, on just adding on what Kate said, there needs to be an infrastructural element that the Republican Party takes seriously. You have the college Republicans that address college students, young Republicans that address the young professionals. You have the Republican Party, the NRCC for the House Republicans, the NRSC for the Senate Republicans, the Republican Governors Association, the RGA. There's all these different groups out here. Ask them, who's your youth director? Who does the outreach for youth in there? None of them do. Absolutely none of them do, and I can say that as a fact. There's not much investment that's going on our side of the political aisle when it comes to this here. I think they've gotten a little lazy, or they just swear off they're young, of course they're going to vote liberal, and there's that Winston Churchill quote, you know, at age 20 you should be a liberal or you have no heart, but by age 40, if you don't vote conservative, you have no brain. You know, our side sometimes just tends to swear off the other side, and they don't think about, well, there has to be a political outreach part. One of the interesting aspects of this RNC autopsy that I'm sure we've all heard of at this point in time is this is the first time, I think, since I've been in D.C. since 1999 that I've actually heard the Republican Party take the youth vote seriously and want to do some actual outreach to it. But we should insist, not only at our national level, but our state and local level, that every state, our state Republican Party and our local groups have a youth outreach person who's going to high schools, community colleges, and other schools in the area to try to recruit. Maybe Fauquier has that, but maybe not, but we need to do a better job of trying to do that. And it's not something that's necessarily always going to be at the national level, but at the state and local, we really need to do it. Look at the Democrats and what they've been able to do in that. Yes, there's a lot of new media, there's a lot of technology that they're using, but you know what? I still believe nothing is going to replace the good old-fashioned person-to-person shaking hands and that personal contact. New media and technology does not replace that, so I just would add that.
Just one really quick point. I completely agree with what Chris just said, and to just kind of say what we're up against, Obama in his last campaign was on a college campus one of every 8 days of the campaign, which is just incredible. And we kind of go, where are Republicans? Like, they've written off the youth as a demographic that they can't get, which is historically untrue. And yeah, I just agree with what you were saying. We cannot abandon the youth vote.
Okay, we're going to try to get into some of the issues you guys brought up if we have time, but I wanted to get this question in. Since we're in Fauquier County, and recently in Fauquier County, we've had a heated debate among Republicans here. We have a Republican-controlled Board of Supervisors, and we had kind of a grassroots movement come up who described themselves as property rights advocates over in farming. It's a farming issue, zoning issue, and this ultimately led to a bill being introduced by Delegate Scott Lingamfelter called the Bonita Bill. A lot of us around here are familiar with it. That bill ultimately went down in defeat in Richmond, but I'm curious about from our panelists, if you could talk a little bit about what kind of lessons we can learn about this conflict between the conservatives and the GOP from this specific instance that happened in, out here in rural kind of Virginia. And I'll start with Mr. Viguerie, since you're the closest geographically to what we've been dealing with here.
Well, I have two presidents of my company. One, Mark Fitzgibbons, president of corporate and legal affairs, is heavily involved and did a lot of the legal work with Martha Bonetta and others on this issue here. Mark had planned to be here today, but he had to go do some activities for the conservative cause in Florida this weekend. But I was talking to him about it a couple of days ago before he left, and he was saying this is nothing more than a local example of what's happening national, where you've got the establishment Republicans nationally disconnected from the grassroots, where you see the local officials here disconnected again from the voters in the grassroots, and you had the special interests, the big state farm agencies and big business didn't want this legislation, and so I think what I talk about in my forthcoming book, Takeover, applies in Washington. It applies here in Fauquier County, that we don't have people who are representing the people. They're still very much tied to the special interests. So this is just a local version of what's happening nationally.
The Tea Party brought a big dose of fiscal conservatism into the scene, and especially after the Bush years. Meanwhile, there's a fight going on, and it's kind of evident if anyone went to CPAC the last couple of years, between libertarians, conservatives, social conservatives, moderates, and even the question of if the party can survive without social conservatives and if they should be ejected for the youth vote. Is a fusionist compromise possible in the near future to bring Republicans to power, or do we need to find a new alignment?
You know, how many people, if I said the term fusion conservatism, you know what I'm talking about? Handful of people. Okay. If I can answer it this way, and what Chris is trying to get at here, the conservative movement, as I mentioned before, and Richard had expounded upon a little bit, is made up of three groups. Those that are liberty-oriented, free markets, entrepreneurship, limited government, small taxation, libertarian brand, if you will. The second group are those that believe in promoting the civil society, transcendent moral values or traditional moral values, more of the traditionalist side. And the third side has tended, and the third leg has tended to be more of the national security side, the kind of the Reagan-esque peace through strength, give or take. To answer Chris' question about this fusion has brought the conservative movement together and has been kind of its coalition, if you will. Post-Reagan, as I mentioned before, there's kind of been a fissure within the movement where post-Cold War, a lot of people are like, well, what direction do we take on foreign policy now? You tend to have one side which tends to be more of one extreme side, the neoconservatives that believe in more of a proactive foreign policy. Then you have kind of the paleo-conservatives, or kind of that believe more in a pre-1945, more non-interventionist, or some people might call them isolationist type of foreign policy. While many people think of, post, 2012 here, that the solution to this problem is more of a political one. We need to do more demographic outreach. We have to do better with our messaging. I think deep down, this is more of a philosophical issue. Can this intellectual coalition still exist post-Reagan? And to answer Chris's question, I think it can. I think there needs to be a refusion, if you will, of sorts, or someone once told me, or an infusion, if you will, with these different groups. We have to recognize that the liberty-oriented and the traditionalists might have things in common, and they have more in common than they do not. I think that the idea that the ends of government should be liberty, but in the sense that liberty so you can pursue virtue should be its goal. You've ever heard the quote about truth withers when freedom dies, yet freedom dies when rampant individualism has no moral core to it. I think that there needs to be more conversations in this direction of how, as a coalition, we can work together and resolve that. Now, the Tea Party, as Mr. Viguerie said, is an interesting element to this equation here, more on the liberty side. But there are ways in which we can work together. We cannot win elections by only having one or two legs of the stool. It's just not going to happen. If we squeeze out the social conservatives or squeeze out the libertarians, whether you're Ron Paul or you're Rick Santorum, if you squeeze those elements out, you're not going to win elections. It's just not going to happen. We need to have all that there. So I think, yes, fusion is important, and we must try to find ways in which to work together moving forward.
Okay. Yep, I completely agree. I think also a point I'd like to make is historically the conservative movement has been much more successful when we focus on what unites us as opposed to the few things. You'd think there were a million things that divided conservatives and libertarians, but the few things that really divide us. I was recently on a panel at CPAC, and it was the focus of the panel was supposed to be on how we secure the youth vote, but what it turned into, because the moderator was a self-proclaimed not conservative libertarian, it turned into just the gay marriage issue. At every chance he could get, he brought it back to the gay marriage issue, which people on the panel just disagreed on. And I think that the panel was in large part extremely unsuccessful, probably uncomfortable to watch, and we didn't actually get our points out about how we actually secure the youth vote, and these important things that I wanted to say I couldn't say because it just kept going back to the one thing we really disagree on. So I really, that was a really big learning experience for me. But I do think there is a place for conservatives, moderates, and libertarians in the Conservative Party, or in the Republican Party. And I think also a point to be made is it's so easy for liberals to be united because, from my perspective, they believe a lot more in moral relativism than we do. We believe in moral absolutism. We have our moral core. We know that it's morally incomprehensible to abandon social conservatism and not protect the life of the unborn. And we're not going to compromise on that. Whereas for liberals, they can have a united front because it's kind of a free-for-all, like, each to their own. If you believe this, it's fine. And so they can appear more united, thanks in large part to the media too, but they appear much more united than we do on this. But I do think that that the best solution is to be all-encompassing and just focus on these values that we all agree on: the limited government, free enterprise, and move forward from there.
I've identified a foolproof way to unite the the libertarian wing of the party in the Republican Party. And I think there's a strong chance, or a decent chance, that this will happen. And that is that in 2016, I think there's a strong chance you'll see Rand Paul on the ticket for VP. And that will bring the libertarians in quite nicely. I've had this discussion literally over 50 years with particularly people in the business community who don't like the social issues. They don't know why they need to be involved. And we tried it that way, quite frankly. We tried it in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 60s, and most of the 70s, where we just focused on national defense and economic issues. And we got 40, 45, 47, sometimes 49% of the vote, not very often 51% of the vote. Then in the second half of the 70s, when we added the social issues, the third leg of that stool, everything changed for the Republicans, and they begin to get 51, 53%, got control of Congress, the Senate, House, etc. But as long as it's just the business community, that's not going to get you to 51%. And there's nothing that the left would like more than to drive the social issues out of the Republican Party.
Make one more point here too. I think there is a bridge in how we can bring Republicans, conservatives, libertarians, all stripes together. First question I ask to my students on the very first day is, what are conservatives inherently trying to conserve? I mean, think about that for a second. We're trying to conserve something, right? Well, and I usually get the typical answers are, well, conservatives they want low taxes, tend to be pro-life, and want to win the wars. Like, okay, but I mean, fundamentally, like, what are they trying to conserve? And after I get it out of them eventually, but our first principles, our founding principles, the concept and notion of the ideas of American exceptionalism. And what is that? It's that we believe in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, the principles that came from that. When we talk about this word fusion, it's funny, I tell and explain it to them that the founders were actually the first fusionists. What is the American experiment? It's the idea that we can self-govern, and that our rights do not come from government, but come from the laws of nature, and nature is God. That is fusionism in itself there. We're articulating the founding principles every time we talk about conservatism. So whether you're libertarian, whether you're traditionalist, or whatever wing that you are on it, the Declaration and the Constitution can bring us together because it embodies everything that America is and our experiment. So I think that's one way in which we can use the Constitution and the Declaration as a bridge and bringing everyone together on our side.
All right, so 30 seconds, not what would you like to see happen, but what do you actually think is going to happen in the next 5 years between conservative movement and the GOP? Are they going to collide and kill each other, or are they going to come together and actually bring a conservative or a good Republican to power and win the presidency, win the Congress?
Okay, tough one. What do I want to happen would be so much easier. I I hope that what I want to happen is what will happen, because I think we all have, or, you know, conservatives, libertarians, fiscal conservatives versus traditional conservatives, whatever you might be, I think we have the same objective, and that is in 2016 to get a Republican elected. So I think I am optimistic that we will come together. I think the best way to do this, and I touched on this before, is to get a candidate that is very appealing to the American people, that isn't afraid to go and speak to youth, that isn't afraid to go into non-traditional communities like the Hispanic community and speak to them about issues that matter to them, like school choice and education reform, and that will remain principled, like Ken Cuccinelli is and says that he will remain principled. We need candidates who say they'll remain principled. And I think Rand Paul being a vice presidential choice would be very interesting. I think that could actually be a very good thing. But yeah, I think that is what will happen. I think we need to elect someone who is going to be very appealing to the majority of Americans. I'm very optimistic that we can win.
30 seconds, Chris.
Oh, that was
Richard Viguerie for president, 2016. What else needs to be said? I would, you know, there's still so much time. I mean, everyone keeps playing they're starting to talk about the 2016 game here. 2 years in politics is a lifetime. There's so much that can happen. We've got a great bench. I would add one thing, that don't forget the states and the localities. Do you realize we have 25 states right now with a Republican governor and state legislature, and we have 30 Republican governors, mixed legislature, Democrats and Republicans. There's a lot of ingenuity. There's a lot of stuff that's going on in the states right now that can really help this out. This is not going to be just a national type of movement. This is going to be a lot of the states and localities. Let's be frank. You know, a lot of the grassroots activism with the Tea Party, especially, that didn't come from Washington. That was a grassroots and a real non-astroturf grassroots movement that happened. So, there's still a lot of time to see if we do well in 2014 and we keep our bench going well and we focus on the states. I think there's good things to come ahead. 30 seconds.
In terms of running for president, been there and done that one, and that's another story. Adam, I'd change your 5 years to 4 years. I think it can be done in 4 years. I think we can do very well in the 2014 election. In 2016, I think there will be a traffic jam of small government, constitutional conservatives, top tier, running for president, and we haven't had that in a long, long time. I can think of Bobby Jindal, Governor Scott Walker, Governor Mike Pence of Indiana, Senator Mike Lee, Senator Rand Paul, Marco Rubio, keep your eye on Jim DeMint, et cetera, et cetera. And there's a lot of them out there, I think, who will be running. We haven't had top-tier conservative candidates for president very often in the last, since Reagan. Carville in 92, said over and over, perhaps some of you remember, it's the economy, stupid. The economy is stupid. I paraphrase that and say it's the primary, stupid. It's the primaries. In 2009, 2010, I just said that ad nauseum because we could see this wave coming. And this wave that came in, and if all it did was bring in Charlie Crist types, and Arlen Specter types, what an opportunity would have been wasted. And we didn't win all that we wanted, but we've made enormous gains in the last couple of elections. So keep your eye on the primaries in 2014, 2016, and the number one thing that we need above everything else. I talked about the number one problem, and that was that conservatives became an appendage of the Republican Party. The number one need that we have going forward above everything else, so much so that nothing's in second, third, fourth place in terms of our need. Number one above everything else, and it's been a need that we've had in the 51 years I've been at the national level in conservative politics, is leadership. We just lack leaders. We have a few now and then. For whatever reason, the Lord has seen to bless the left with far more effective leaders than the conservatives do. We need leadership, mostly younger, new leadership, and it'll be huge. Look what Rand Paul has done to the party, Mike Lee, Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and these others out there. So we need new, young leadership, and I think that'll be huge and change everything so that by 2017, I think we can be governing America. That's 4 years.
Okay, thank you very much. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I know some of these guys got to run, so you could give it up for our panelists.